The lockdown was definitely something that changed a lot of things everywhere, and with changes everything was being revolutionized to online, and with a lot of desperate men being constricted to their closed walls, there were things that the men craved, and the main source of that thing became Onlyfans, and it boomed like the Zoom video app, and people were crazily invested into the app and getting the thing they paid for, and it became the large thing for such creeps that were able to get into profile of these girls and creep their way in. And such case was that of Kat West, and this case was big. It is not every day that you find a naked body face down in your neighborhood. With almost no helpful clues and a mystery murderer still on loose, nobody knew the direction this case was going. There was the Onlyfans and a regular clue. With life out and open on social media, and with sites like Onlyfans, even though they are proving itself to be revenue-generating sites for some, it is also a dangerous haven for creepers who are making intimacy a commodity, and thus able to act upon their urges that were rather repressed, and some are going to even greater extent to act upon these urges, and in turn, raising a concern about the safety of women working there. Kat West's lifeless body was found outside Calorina, Alabama by a neighbor who saw the body nude lying on the street, was a kind of case that doesn't stop. This story was something that people in the news wanted to get their hands on. This was not very normal for the place and was getting every bit of exposure. There was nothing much on the case, and only thing that was different about the case was a bottle of absinthe tilted on the phone, and that was the only clue for probably a thing different about it. The police looked into the case, and it seemed to do with Onlyfans. A dead Kat West and her husband Jeff West. This was a very complicated case, with no evidence and no clues, just the endless parade between one dead Kat West, her husband Jeff, and an Onlyfans page, where her life was exposed in its natural naked form. Kat West was one of those extroverted women who would put their whole life on the social media to be seen by all, and now with Onlyfans, it wasn't just out there, it was out there, and it was more intimate than it usually is. When her body was found naked in the streets, the first suspicion that was raised on Jeff, her husband, and the first odd thing that they noticed was his reaction to her death, which was very calm and poised. But there was the history of him being in the army, so the calm posture wasn't really a big mystery, since everyone almost knows the things soldiers go through are much worse than we can imagine. So even though Jeff was arrested, many officials didn't really believe that he would do that. Even Kat's friends said that he would never do that. So the next on suspicion were the countless number of people on her Onlyfans, and this was something that could have been the reason. She was putting herself out in the open. Her sexual content was out in the open for a lot of people to see, and there is no doubt that how many creepers might have been on there waiting to prey on her. Could be any of the Onlyfans guys who might have confronted her in an alleyway or a street and then stalked her and killed her. One scenario could be that maybe the husband had enough of her lewd shoots and then kill her. But there was no hint of jealousy in Jeff, so police already ruled out that possibility. According to the judges who sentenced Jeff 16 years in prison for the murder of Kat West, this happened. One day, when Kat and Jeff were out, Jeff must have confronted Kat about the Onlyfans thing. "You keep posting those pictures on the internet," must have said Jeff. "It is not putting a very nice impression to the world out," he continued. "You know how people might see you," Jeff said. And as he said all this, she might have ignored him, and Jeff, being an army, possessed the skills necessary to kill a man. And then, the innocent-looking Jeff must have, in the moment of heat, turned into this barbaric devil, with his eyes red and raged, and took the absinthe bottle and hit her in the head with great power to kill her. Even though Jeff pleads innocent even after 3 years of his wife's death, there is still a lot of speculation and missing facts. Jeff said that it was just a drunken accident, but we can never really be sure who and what killed her. Only if Kat could come back and tell us who killed her, Jeff or Onlyfans. We are not sure that if the verdict was right, if it was the vengeful, angry husband or just a mere drunk accident. But there could be more to this case than just these two assumptions. We cannot ignore the fact of the sinister creep that are behind these screens, buying intimate shots of these women, obsessing over their bodies, and pushing to rather calm the urges they feel. This is not much in the open other than the husband, who is trying to plead not guilty and is fighting for his innocence. Even though they were an odd couple, there was no motive or reason for his husband to act so irrationally. So was it Jeff? Was it the accident that he claims? Or is it something more than what it seems to be? Is there a creeper who just got away with murder of the now deceased OnlyFans model, Kat West?
First of all, let me say this is not an indictment of OnlyFans. If someone wants to profit from sharing pictures of themselves or their body, that's totally their right, and I respect that. I'm not casting judgments on anyone who chooses to do so. But let me be clear. OnlyFans just about ruined my life, and I've never even set up a profile. It all kicked off not long after I broke up with a guy I'd been dating for about 3 to 4 months. As a single mom, it's way harder to get dates than I'd like it to be, but at the same time, I totally understand why someone wouldn't want to raise a child that isn't theirs. I mean, I wish more guys would be open to it. It's not like I'd never have a kid with them too, but it's just a sad fact that it puts guys off when you've got a child from a prior relationship. So you can imagine how excited I was when I met Richard. It's not his real name, but I'd rather not attract his attention, thank you very much. Having a 6-year-old son didn't seem to bother him in the least bit, and he even asked a lot of questions about him. I found the whole thing so refreshing and mature that by the time Richard asked me out, I just about bit his arm off accepting the invite. But then the first red flag appeared when he started making comments about my son, calling him Daddy. That wasn't the red flag in and of itself, it was more his reactions when I told him, no, my son has a dad and I don't want him confused as he grows up. Richard didn't seem to respect that position whatsoever and actually said some quite personal things regarding my taste in men, as well as the integrity of my son's father. It's a complicated situation, I'll concede that, but Richard's take on the whole thing was frankly disgusting and misogynistic. But given that it was a very unusual setup, I didn't want to give up on him so quickly, not since guys like him seem to be so hard to come by. But then, after 2 months of clashing, not often, I should add, I had to face the music and accept that if there was a guy out there for me, it certainly wasn't him. I've dated guys for 18 months who took the breakup better than Richard. They're always rough, but I think if I actually told you what Richard did, you'd think that I was making this all up. Needless to say, his reaction totally justified my decisions to end things. End things, and that's exactly how I phrased it too. But that breakup was far from the end of my ordeal with Richard. And you know what? It's kind of my fault too. In fact, it's mostly my fault, because if I hadn't been so trusting, I wouldn't even be writing this right now. The one big mistake I made was trusting Richard to keep private certain pictures I'd sent him. I think I trusted him because, well, he sent me pictures of him too. I think that's why there's a lot less nude leaks than there are nudes. It's like Americans and the Russians in the 80s, mutually assured destruction. You release mine, well, I'll release yours. But after we broke up, I deleted all of his intimate pictures, and I was foolish enough to think that he'd also done the same. Because the next thing I know, I got a message from a friend of mine saying something like, "Oh, you have an OnlyFans. You go, girl." I had to ask her what OnlyFans was. I literally had no idea at the time. She replies like, "You're joking, right? Was this supposed to be a secret?" Immediately, I start Googling OnlyFans, and as you can imagine, I'm pretty shocked at what I see. The whole website is basically homemade lewd images, and for those that aren't familiar, and from what I could gather, the girls in question make quite a lot of money too. I mean, I wouldn't say no to an extra $2,000 a month, but I hadn't set up a profile, had I? I asked my friend to send me anything she's found with my name on it, then what do you know? There's a freaking OnlyFans profile set up in my name, and the whole preview picture in the banner was a raunchy picture that I'd sent to Richard. The profile said like, free to subscribe, so I made a dummy user account to sign up, only to discover that Richard must have uploaded about 10 different pictures I'd sent to him, all with these disgusting captions that I'd rather not repeat here. I was angry, so angry, but I didn't get scared until I saw that he'd put up my home address, my actual home address, apartment number, postcode, everything. It kicked in how much danger I was in, and I just burst into tears thinking that my own selfish actions had exposed my only son to danger. I know it was all Richard, and I know if he was just normal, then yeah, it wouldn't have happened. But I'm a mother. I should know better. I'm not some attention-seeking teenager anymore. I just wanted to feel wanted, though. Surely people can understand that. In the end, I managed to get the profile taken down, and I think Onlyfans and other sites like that now make you verify your identity so stuff like that can't happen again. But what if you manage to get a hold of a girl's ID or something? The system they have doesn't completely eliminate the chance of fake profiles being set up. Like I said at the start, I don't mean to judge anyone who wants to do that kind of thing. I just hope they have their safety and security in mind because, as I think we all know, there are some serious psychos out there. We're going all the way back to the fall and winter of 1976 for this one. I know, I'm old. And granted it's an old story, I promise you it's a good one. And in the summer of '76, my stupid self decided to move out to California. It was a well-meaning venture, I assure you, but a failed one in every conceivable aspect. I'd moved back to Arkansas less than a year after I moved out there, in a place like home, I suppose. But it also might have had something to do with a roommate I had when I was living in Sacramento. I was kind of a latecomer to the hippie movement, too young for the summer of love or the Vietnam protests, but seeing what the war did to my old man was just awful. I was young, real young when he came back, but I remember how different he was, just like a little piece of him was lost over there somehow. So, it wasn't until the mid-70s that I got a wild hair up my butt to move out to San Francisco. My old man said he'd give me $100 in bus money if I stayed in high school long enough to graduate. So, I did, and that same summer I headed out to San Fran on a Greyhound bus. Only I didn't quite make it. I stopped to see a guy I used to go to camp with in Sacramento and, well, just sort of stayed there. His parents offered me their spare room until I had enough money to carry on to Frisco, but living there made me feel like a bum. So, after squirreling away my first 2 paychecks, I decided to move into a shared apartment with 2 strangers. I meet up with the landlord at the house in question. We do a little walk around and he shows me where I'll be staying. The place was really nice. 3 separate bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and all the ground floor facilities you could imagine. Kitchen, laundry room, TV room, garage, and the rent was enticingly low considering it was such a nice place. Both guys who lived there were out at work at the time, so I didn't get to meet any of them in advance, and obviously I wasn't permitted to nosy around in either of their bedrooms, so I really didn't get a sense of their personalities. But boy, was that about to change fast. A week later, I moved into the free room and met the 2 guys I'd be living with. One guy was named Richard, and the other guy was named Brad. Richard seemed kinda weird and untidy, but he seemed to mostly keep to himself, while Brad was much more friendly and outgoing. The thing was, Brad was moving out at some point over the following 2 weeks, and he wanted to give me the skinny on Richard before he left. Basically, he asked me how badly I needed the room. I told him real bad. It was either there or be homeless for the foreseeable future. And that's when he tells me that Richard can be cool when he wants to be, but he's definitely a few cards short of a full deck. I asked him what he means by that, and he just replies, "You'll see. Just keep your eye out for other apartments. The Bee generally has some good listings." At first, I just figured I'd waded into some slightly bitter roommate rivalry or politics, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I wasn't about to take sides after having been there for a grand total of 5 minutes, so I decided to play it diplomatically. But Brad was right. Richard was really weird. And not even weird in a fun, hippie way. He wasn't just waving his freak flag high, man. He was the freak flag, all on his own. First time I noticed was when I walked into the kitchen and Richard was sat at the table, reading a newspaper while holding an orange on top of his head. I asked him what he was doing, and he replied something like, absorbing vitamin C. I laughed, thinking he was just being silly, but when I turned to look at him, deadpan. The guy was deadly serious. I start explaining that's not how nutrition works, and he responds by telling me not to lecture him on what goes on in his body, how it was his body and he knew best about it. Naturally, I'm just like, okay, dude, whatever you say, being as non-confrontational as possible, but the second I saw Brad, I conceded that he was right. Richard was crazy. Just how crazy, I had no idea, but I was sure about to find out. Richard's behavior remained curiously strange until the time that Brad moved out. It wasn't anything too scary, just stuff that made you roll your eyes or shake your head. Like at one point, we're eating dinner in front of the TV, and Richard kind of sits up, stares into space for a moment, checks his own pulse, then says, "My heart just stopped beating." Brad seemed to have learned his lesson how to deal with such insane behavior because he falsely expresses some mild concern before suggesting Richard go take a nap, which he then does. Like some hypochondriac child, he finished his dinner, then goes to take a nap to alleviate his, what, his dead heart? I have no idea. Like I said, it wasn't scary, just kind of annoying. All the scary stuff came after Brad moved out. In fact, I think Brad was the only thing keeping a lid on Richard's behavior, because the same day Brad leaves is the same day Richard took a turn for the worse. So, like I've mentioned, I was working part-time in Sacramento, working 5-hour shifts, 4 days a week over at a nearby grocery store. One day I get back from my shift and Richard is standing over the bathroom sink, looking into a piece of broken mirror he'd propped up against the counter, and he's shaving all his hair off with a straight razor. "New haircut, buddy?" I remember asking him. "No, it's my skull. I think it's fractured." "Well, better get down to the hospital, Dickie boy. I hear those can be quite serious." I'd pretty much adopted Brad's approach wholesale by that point, kindly acknowledge and then disengage. But Richard responds by telling me that not only is his skull fractured, but that he can feel the plates moving around under his skin. Now, I'm no doctor, but I was 99% sure that that was impossible. And when I took a look at his request, there was no bruising, no blood, nothing. He's just having another one of his hypochondriac health scares. One time we're having dinner and Richard dropped me a compliment on my sausage gravy. It was like a double compliment, since it was my mom's secret recipe too. Turns out Brad was right. Richard could be nice when he wanted to be. But then he somehow managed to ruin the moment by saying something like, "Yeah, you're a real good cook. Much better than my mom. She used to try and poison me." Again, like the thing with the orange, I thought he was cracking a joke, so I laughed. But just like the thing with the orange, he simply stares at me, totally straight-faced, and I realized that it wasn't a joke. Only this time he's actually kind of offended that I didn't take him seriously, and that's the first time I saw Richard's mean side come out. He just stared at me, holding his knife and fork so hard his fists were shaking, and for a moment, I was actually scared he was just going to lunge at me from across the table. Instead, he picks up his plate, clears it, then marches off up to his room. A few hours later, he apologized for being so rude. I forgave him, and thus the cycle began anew. He'd act perfectly normal, then some weird outbursts would have me reconsidering Brad's suggestion on keeping an eye out for a new apartment. But until I could get more hours at the Safeway, that just wasn't an option for me. If you remember, I moved into the apartment during the fall, and Rich's behavior had been, at worst, amusingly bizarre for the majority of my stay. But the closer and closer we got to Christmas, the more he seemed to be slipping further and further into some downward spiral, and it had turned out to be one he'd never fully recover from. And it was definitely one that was made entirely worse by our use of recreational drugs. Like I said, late blooming hippie here, so when Richard suggested we get our hands on some pot and LSD, I just thought, groovy, you know? I didn't stop to consider that might be a terrible idea given his psychological issues. I actually kind of thought drugs might help him, but good lord did that turn out to be total naivety. Like I said, I thought a trip or two might help Richard out, give him a little perspective, but using drugs just sparked some sort of fire in him. He didn't just use them recreationally like me and my buddies had back in Little Rock. He used them habitually. He tripped every night for a week, until I literally had to hide the little eyedropper of acid I'd bought for us. And when he finally came out of it, he was all kinds of messed up. The day after he sobered up, I heard him coming down for breakfast, and when he walks into the kitchen area, and I look up, I see he's as naked as the day he was born. Obviously, I'm like, screaming, "Richard, put on some clothes for Christ's sake." He just responds with, "Why?" Grabs some cereal, pours himself a bowl, then just sits down to eat. I was just getting progressively insanely more uncomfortable, and I couldn't bring myself to eat in front of a naked man like that, so I just got up and walked out. Huge mistake. Because I didn't properly address the whole nudity thing, he took that as him having a free pass. So, with an infuriatingly ever-increasing frequency, I'd have my roommate stumbling around the house, totally nude, while taking pulls on a bottle of Jack Daniels. Now, most people I've told this story to, they have said that they'd have been gone the moment the nudity thing started. But what can I say? It was the 70s. I was something of a freak myself, and if I couldn't handle one little weirdo in Sacramento, how was I going to stomach rubbing shoulders with hardcore Frisco hippies once I made it out there? Nope. Instead, the final straw was coming home to find him making cocktails. So like I said, I walk into the house one day and I hear the blender in the kitchen whirring. I wait for the break in the whirring to call out to him as I walk into the TV room. He had to walk that way to get to the kitchen, asking him what he's making. He just replies, "Cocktails," in this dull, flat tone that let me know that he was wasted. But when I enter the kitchen, I get this strong odor of whiskey, along with something else. Following whatever he'd been doing, Richard had evidently made this very out-of-character attempt to clean up after himself. But he hadn't been completely thorough, as on the plain white countertop, I could still make out what looked like streaks of some thick red liquid. I walk over, run my finger over a patch of it, rubbing it together between my fingers before feeling that it has a distinctly sticky texture to it. "Richard?" I said. "Is this blood?" "No," he replied. Suddenly I get this sudden urge to lift up the lid of the trash can, but at the same time, I'm also filled with dread. Whatever, or whoever that blood belonged to, there'd surely be remnants of it in the trash. In fact, upon seeing a small, bloody fingerprint on the trash can's lid, I'm sure that's where I'd find the remains. Then, of course, I opened the trash to see a bloody paper bag with what was clearly a stripy raccoon tail sticking out of it. During the mother of all arguments that followed, when I asked him what in God's name he was doing, he tried to palm me off with an excuse I've never, ever forgotten. He briefly stops the blender from whirring and says, "It's going to stop my heart from shrinking." Then carries on grinding up this reddy brown mess of soda, ice, and what I could only assume was raccoon meat. This crazy monster thought he had some rare medical condition where his heart was basically wasting away, and the cure was to blend the organ meats of trapped animals with Jack Daniels and Coca-Cola, of all things. Like I said, that was the final straw, and by that time, another guy was living there with us too. We discussed giving Richard a kind of ultimatum, either shape up or ship out. But considering he'd reached the butchering animals and eating them raw stage of his madness, we agreed the best thing was for us to just get out of there. I called my old camp buddy that night and begged my way back into his parents' spare room. I carried on working at the Safeway for a time, got some more hours, and since I wasn't paying rent in my buddy's parents' place, getting some bus money and a security deposit was much easier. I didn't hear no more of Richard, and when I finally left San Francisco in January of '77, I never looked back. Cut to just over 2 years later, I think about March of 1979, I'm living back with my parents in Little Rock, and I've cleaned up my act, and I'm working at another grocery store with my mind set on applying to colleges. Sometimes I used to get up real early and head down to the grocery store at around 6:30 a.m. to help the owner prep for opening hours, and a real small part of that was unpacking and arranging newspapers near the smaller front counter. I used to kind of take my time with this particular job on occasion, sipping my coffee, flicking through the sports section, all away from the prying eyes of the owner who was counting cash or whatever in his office. One morning, I catch a headline in, I think was the National Enquirer, saying something like, "Cannibal Killer's Trial Date Set." Obviously, that's not the sort of headline you read every day, so I start reading the article to get more details. And guess whose name I see, just a few lines down? Yup, my insane, crazy old roommate, Richard Chase. There's even a little picture of him in the margin, and clear as day, it's him. Same guy I lived with for the better part of 5 months. This is all from memory, so you'd have to ask Google for all the details, but here's what I remember. After I left the home I shared with Richard, his condition worsened and worsened over the course of the year, until finally in the winter of '77, he commits his first murder by randomly shooting a guy in the street. A few weeks later, he tries a home invasion, only the family isn't home, so he can't hurt anyone. So he decides to wait. But when they do get home, he gets the heebie-jeebies, turns tail, and runs. The family then arrives home to find that Richard had broken into their baby's nursery before going to the bathroom on the kids' clothes. He was absolutely sick in the head. A short time later, he tries another home invasion, and this time, he kills a pregnant woman. But here's the really messed up part. Before sleeping with her corpse, I read he put dog feces in the poor girl's mouth too. It makes you wonder what goes through a man's head to do something as absolutely insane as that. I followed the case for a while after, and I was happy when I heard he got the death penalty for the things he did. He ended up taking his own life before they could get him to the gas chamber, though. Figured he wanted to go out on his own terms. Only thing that messes with me is that some people say he wasn't crazy, that he knew what he was doing when he killed those women and did those awful things to them. I'm not saying he didn't deserve to die. That's not what I'm saying at all. Heck, I'd even kick the chair out from under that guy in a hot minute if he gave me the chance. But the only thing that's crazy is saying that he ain't. You understand me? I live with that man. I ate with him. I tripped with him. I know Richard Chase. And the cheese slid off that boy's crackers a long time before he started killing. He was crazy as a dog in a hubcap factory the whole time I knew him. And although what he did was a tragedy, I wasn't entirely surprised by it. I feel lucky to have gotten out when I did. Hang around for another year and it might have been me getting shot dead at the side of the road. But the thing that really sticks with me isn't the survivor guilt, or whatever people want to call it. It's wondering how evil like that even comes into this world.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.